An unwillingness to decentralise decision-making authority and a failure to communicate accurate information are the most consequential weaknesses at the state level that have contributed to the Russian military's subpar performance to date in the war with Ukraine. These characteristics are exacerbated by other historic factors found throughout Russian society, which also permeate the military as a reflection of that society. They include an imperialist national identity, endemic corruption, and societal brutality. To these systematic problems must be added the inherent difficulties of what the Russian military was supposed to achieve in its first major peer conflict since World War II, and elements of simple military incompetence. The unwillingness to decentralise decision-making authority is a symptomatic of over 5 centuries of Russian autocracy. It is why Russia lacks an effective non-commissioned officer corps and its top-down command and control system, which is slow to provide timely direction to forces at the front. This is exacerbated by a failure to communicate accurate information, especially at the strategic level, which results in decision-making based on faulty information and reinforces bad decisions due to inaccurate feedback. These two characteristics create a command, control and communication system unsuited for modern warfare, but concurrent with a Russian way of war that has been influenced by a culture of imperialism, corruption and brutality. Imperialism prevented the Russian national security services from seeing agency in other peoples, which led them to underestimate possible Ukrainian resistance and Western resolve. Corruption compounded personnel and supply challenges for the Russian military. A reliance on brutality to control its own soldiers and assert control over occupied populations exacerbated factors in the Russian military that are detrimental to good order, discipline, morale and unit cohesion, and provided additional motivation to Ukrainians to resist Russian aggression. These are not really weaknesses of the Russian system, but consequences of that system. Furthermore, despite their detrimental impact on military effectiveness, these factors have sometimes worked for Russia and provided, counterintuitively, advantages such as the political will to conduct attritional warfare at a cost that no Western society would accept. This is significant because all the above factors are endemic to Russian social and political culture and will continue, barring a major social revolution in Russia of the scale of 1917. This means there will be no permanent solution to the war in Ukraine, even if a peace treaty is signed. These cultural factors will eventually drive Russia to regain its military capacity and renew its aggression against Ukraine and hostility to the West. As long as Russia is autocratic with a propensity for self-deception and imperialism, it will try again to assert hegemony over Ukraine and other portions of its former empire. The future war will likely resemble the war in Ukraine, a high-intensity war of attrition where Moscow is willing to make brutal sacrifices to outlast its foes. This is not a case of predicting that history will repeat itself, but that Russia's basic political nature will. Only if Russia overcomes its history and changes internally will it ever behave differently externally. The Russian military reflects a society whose government, with rare exceptions, has never been based on the consent of the governed. Russia's default form of government is autocracy, where absolute power over a state is concentrated in the hands of one person, whose decisions are subject neither to external legal restraints nor to regularized mechanisms of popular control. Autocracy creates a military that adheres to orders, as the militaries of democratic societies do, but also one where decentralization, honest communication, and individual rights are not only incompatible with the ethos of the state, but also threaten it. An autocracy cannot survive if its military culture is in opposition to itself. Hence, over centuries, the Russian military developed to protect the state by defeating its enemies while having a system compatible with autocracy so as not to undermine it. This is why the Russian military has never empowered NCOs, expected them to show initiative, or trained them to serve as a bridge between officers and enlisted men to mentor the former and teach the latter. In the pre-industrial age, this was not a serious drawback, since the Russian army, like others of that era, was based on long-service peasant conscripts who were trained by rote to conduct simple maneuvers and fire their weapons. The hardiness of Russian soldiers and the size of Russia's population produced armies able to defeat even Napoleon. Industrial age warfare created a need for soldiers with specialized skills and leadership abilities, i.e. NCOs. While industrialized nations developed small unit leaders from working class foremen and artisans. Predominantly peasant Russia could not, due to its small working class and the unwillingness of the Russian officers to treat NCOs better than serfs, which they were till 1861. In 1903, the Imperial Russian Army had only 12,109 long service soldiers, which averaged about 2 senior NCOs per company, whereas German units of this era would have 12. As a result, as late as 1912, the Russian General Staff Academy taught only 2 maneuvers, advance and retreat, and tactical formations were constructed on an understanding that more complex maneuvers could cause panic and confusion. The men were simply gathered in thick masses and sent to charge the enemy line, regardless of their vulnerability to artillery. When the Bolsheviks in 1917 needed an army to defend their revolution, rather than creating an NCO corps, they formed the Red Army as a reflection of the top-heavy, officer-centric Imperial Army, using former Tsarist officers to train the lead force. This continued throughout the Soviet era. There were few senior NCOs in the Soviet Army, which had a 1% re-enlistment rate, so junior officers fulfilled those duties. Soldiers who held junior NCO ranks were conscripts who attended a 6-month course and then served as sergeants for their final 18 months of service. Ironically, by one estimate, most junior NCOs were Ukrainians. Only one smart enough to do it, eh? You fucking clowns. Reports that the post-Soviet army had developed an NCO corps proved to be overly optimistic. Some Russian soldiers may wear chevrons, but they do not fulfill the functions normally associated with NCOs. Russian army junior officers, as in Soviet times, bear the burden of their own responsibilities, plus those normally handled in Western armies by senior NCOs. This increases their span of control and the number of personnel and functions a leader must supervise, beyond what young leaders can properly handle, especially in combat. This contributes to a heavy casualty rate for junior officers in a military that already had problems retaining them. It then cascades into a high casualty rate for field-grade officers who must be forward to ensure missions are accomplished. This reinforces historic tendencies for top-down direction and an unwillingness to delegate authority. Heavy officer casualties also inhibit Russia's military efforts to regenerate itself. Basic and advanced training in Russia's army is done at the individual unit level, but most officers deployed with their units to Ukraine. This left limited cadres at home bases to instruct new conscripts. Fewer officers left alive means fewer who can pass on their combat experience to conscripts, which results in fewer well-trained replacements. Evidence of this is clear among Russia's newly mobilized cadres in Ukraine. Because of this centralization and the historic lack of an NCO corps, Russia's military has depended on rote training of conscripts to conduct simple battle drills. And strict adherence of orders by field officers. Plans were developed at the most senior level available. In this system, initiative was harmful because it might undermine a commander's overall plan. The decision-making process, sometimes known as the Observe, Orient, Decide Act, in the Russian army has been slow because of the time it takes for information from the front to reach headquarters. The senior-most leader to make a decision, transmit the order to the front, and then have it executed. This has often put the Russian army at a disadvantage because per the OODA loop concept, the party that completes the cycle faster gains an advantage as the cycle continues, to the point when its enemy is overcome by events. The OODA loop concept was developed in the late 1970s, yet at the turn of the 20th century, Russian Minister of War, General Alexei Kuropatkin, recognized that the slowness of the army's information gathering and decision-making processes put it at a disadvantage with modern foes. Kuropatkin tried to institute numerous reforms, including the conduct of free play exercises. In 1902, he led approximately 100,000 men on maneuvers near Kursk to test the army's ability to quickly move from the defense to the offense under realistic conditions. Unfortunately for Russia, his reforms, including the concept of free play exercises, were opposed by many senior officers and never took hold. Even in the Kursk maneuvers, free play had its limits, as the entire exercise was mapped out and published in detail before a single soldier had marched onto the field. Each day's activities were carefully planned right down to allotting time for officers to recall their daily activities in personal diaries. The traditions of the Imperial Russian Army continued to the Soviet Red Army, where adherence to orders was paramount over initiative or even common sense. This is seen in the message traffic between two headquarters on June the 22nd, 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked.
"We're being fired upon. What should we do?"
reported one frontline commander.
"You must be insane. And why is your signal not in code?"
came the reply from higher headquarters. While this could be an example of peacetime lethargy not yet leaving the system, it also reflected that Stalin had ordered his military not to fire at German forces because he feared giving them a pretext for war. Even self-preservation could not overcome the necessity to fulfill all orders exactly as given and not show initiative. Despite the experience of World War II, the Soviet army continued to centralize planning, discourage initiative, and conduct staged maneuvers. During the 1967 maneuvers to celebrate the 50th anniversary of communist rule, enlisted tank crews were replaced with newly commissioned second lieutenants, and the bottom of the Dnieper River was lined with steel and concrete to facilitate a tank fording demonstration. When the Soviet army fought in Afghanistan, it found itself hobbled by age-old problems. One critique by two senior Soviet officers of the army's performance in Afghanistan noted, "The failure of officers to demonstrate decisiveness and initiative in accomplishing combat tasks when fighting, waiting for prompting and advice from seniors. They tried to act by rote without taking into consideration the nature of the terrain and the situation at hand. They displayed indecisiveness in maneuvering their forces." In historical context, the initial invasion of Ukraine was consistent with Russia's military past. To our best knowledge, the plan was drawn up independent of those who would implement it. When events did not go according to plan, commanders at all levels were unable to adjust to a situation that defied their expectations. Rather than improvise, units near Kyiv were withdrawn and transferred to Donbass to implement yet another plan drafted from above. Once in Donbass, they had only one strategy: attrition warfare by frontal attacks, for which minimal training was necessary. Donbass became akin to the battles of Sevastopol 1854, Mukta 1905, and Tannenberg 1914, but with drones. Another factor, already alluded to, is that staged, centralized maneuvers misled not only foreign observers, but Russian leaders themselves regarding the combat readiness of the army. Impressions gathered from carefully rehearsed demonstrations often have no relation to a military's true capacity to deal with the violence, friction, and logistics of modern warfare. To know its true status, the military should have tested its ability to fight by exercising against an unpredictable opposing force. Possibly the last Kremlin leader with a combat experience to realize this was Premier Nikita Khrushchev, whose memoirs recorded his being appalled by unrealistic Soviet naval exercises and the lack of the professional knowledge of the officers leading them. President Putin does not have a military background or combat experience. Neither does Sergei Shoigu, a former civil engineer and minor communist apparatchik, who has been the Minister of Defense for over a decade, until being recently removed. Both have attended numerous military demonstrations, but probably never realized that choreographed events cannot provide an army with the training and experience necessary to deal with the inherent friction of war. Apparently, many Russian generals made the same mistake, and as one critic observed, they found themselves most at home, sitting safely in viewing stands, watching their troops in the military equivalent of a dance recital. The historic Russian phobia towards decentralized decision-making has manifested itself for centuries in the lack of a functioning NCO corps, an officer corps unable to act without higher direction, and a military system focused on presenting the illusion of combat capability. These consequences of the Russian state system are unlikely to change barring wholesale cultural changes in the Russian state and society. Change would require an honest discussion of problems and possible solutions, the first step in any reform movement. However, reform is unlikely as long as the Russian government fears honest feedback and communication both up and down the chain of command. I'll end part 1 here, guys. Thank you all for watching. Slava Ukraini. Herium Slava.